Graham, we did an interview a few weeks back. It was with a fellow by the name of Shayne Randall. He's a local author. He's a historian. He ended up writing a great book. It's entitled The Pepper Kid, The Life and Times of Ken Randall, Hockey's Bad Hombre. And the best part about this book, too, is, that's a centerpiece of it, but it also serves as a little bit of a history of the early days of the National Hockey League. And we welcome back into the conversation Shayne, who was at the game yesterday. Shayne, thank you so much for stopping by again. Really appreciate it.
Well, really glad to be here and talk some hockey.
Yeah, what was the game like yesterday?
Well, it was a blowout, to put it mildly. I went there hoping I'd see the new phenom, Austin Matthews. He didn't play. He's got an injury. But I came away really impressed with this Mitch Marner. I had never seen him play. And, boy, who needs Austin Matthews when you got him? He is electric.
Yeah, he played really well, and hopefully that 4-point game will kind of get him going, similar to the numbers he was putting up a year ago. What was the atmosphere like? I know we had talked a couple of weeks ago. You were excited to get going, and just for people out there who aren't aware, your grandfather, Ken Randall, he actually played in the original game back in 1917 against the Montreal Wanderers.
Yes, he did, and of course, as some people now know, that game was in Montreal. But it was 100 years ago, and it was a blowout game there, but the other way around. The Wanderers got ahead by a whole bunch, and Toronto came on late, but still lost 10-9. But the game yesterday was the atmosphere was totally exciting. It was they had a lot of kids there. They had a lot of celebrities, former Leafs. They had just about everybody and his brother, and it was a great spectacle for sure.
Actually, look at social media today. There's a bunch of people from Peterborough that were down there. Old Joel Scott was down there. I know Rellinger was down there. Terry Guile was down there. These people don't have jobs.
Great
apparently.
Peterborough contingent represented at the Leaf game yesterday. Emotionally, what was it like knowing that your grandfather was one of the original pioneers who played in that original game? That must have been a pretty cool feeling.
Well, it was, and I couldn't help thinking how he would view the game today as opposed to then. They were lucky they had a league back 100 years ago. They ended up with 4 teams starting the season, and the Wanderers arena burnt down 5 games into the season. They finished with 3 teams. They didn't even have numbers on the back of their sweaters. That's how tough the times were. So I would think that he would be very impressed with how far the game has come in 100 years. The sweaters they wore yesterday, he would have loved those. They were dolled up, saying Toronto Arenas. Now the original sweater, I've got one of the replica sweaters on today, and it was just a plain T on the front, no numbers on the back. I think he would have been very impressed.
He would have been impressed, and then when he saw what a hooking penalty was, he'd say, wait a minute. He'd say, give me a break. I would have spent my entire game in the box.
Oh, yeah. There wasn't a penalty yesterday that would have been a penalty back then. There wasn't one. They would have had a penalty-free game. That's how much the game's changed.
And you were saying there was a piece done in the Kingston Whig Standard as it pertains to your grandfather, who was from the Kingston area, and it even had a little bit of information that you weren't necessarily aware of.
Yeah, I just got wind of it, and it was printed yesterday. It's an excellent piece. So any listeners out there who want to go online, Whig Standard, Ken Randall, they'll be able to read it. And it's a wonderful piece and a great addendum to the book, The Pepper Kid. It gives you a little more insight into certain events that he was involved in over the years. And if you don't think he was a tough hombre, you will after you read the piece in the Whig Standard.
Yeah, and maybe you could reiterate just how tough this hombre was. He was somebody who was very violent, kind of one of those early pioneers. But as you were explaining to me last time, that was kind of the way the game was played in many respects. It was just that sort of game where people were probably going to get hurt and there was going to be some serious injuries.
Well, if you weren't tough, there were only 7 or 8 skaters per team, plus a goalie. To just stay in the league, you had to be tough. You just couldn't be just a playmaker and a stick handler and a goal scorer. You had to be able to defend. You had to be able to take the rough going. All these guys were tough guys, all of them.
I have that article in front of me right now, and I like this line I'm reading right here. If I can read it from the Whig Standard, from the article you were just referring to. Where'd it go? I just lost it. He was referred to as a bad guy and bad man and a bad actor. He even went off and hauled off and slugged an opponent in front of Lady Bing, of all people. Newspaper reporters dubbed him a bad man and a bad actor for his actions, which frequently included verbally abusing referees, wielding his stick like an axe, and trading punches with some of the biggest stars in the game. In today's terms, Randall would likely be referred to as a goon.
Does that seem like a fair assessment?
No. No, not at all. He was a tough guy. I wouldn't say he was a goon. To me, a goon is somebody who doesn't add much offensively to the proceedings. That article in the Whig Standard ends with a statement I think is shocking, one I didn't even realize. He scored 70 goals in the NHL. 20% of them were game winners.
Wow.
Think about that. Is there anybody playing hockey that has that statistics or has played? I don't know. That seems to me an enormous
I would imagine
statistic.
that would be among the higher percentages for game-winning goals. We're chatting with Shayne Randall. The name of the book is The Life and Times of Ken Randall, Hockey's Bad Hombre, The Pepper Kid. And I'm curious, do you remember the first time you ever went and saw a National Hockey League game?
I remember the first time I listened to one, 1947, Foster Hewitt, and I listened to it with my grandfather, Ken Randall.
Oh, really?
The last time I was watched a Maple Leaf game was at Maple Leaf Gardens. So I haven't seen them. I've seen a couple with my son in Florida, but they weren't Maple Leaf games. But the big thing today is, and the reason I'm reborn as a fan is the game is so good now. Now, it went to some periods in the 70s and 80s where you couldn't give me a ticket. Now, boy, it's a spectacle.
Go back to 1947. I'm kind of intrigued by, and I've always heard about the days of listening to the games on the radio. Obviously, TV was not a fixture yet back in 1947. So take me back to listening to those games on the radio with Foster Hewitt.
Well, the reason Hewitt is so famous is because he was so descriptive in the way he called a game. No TV then, of course. We were just as adamant fans back then as any fans are today. We just gathered around the radio and we listened to the game start to finish. He was just such a wonderful broadcaster. The way he described games was unique.
Shayne Randall, author and IDub hockey historian, here with us on the regulars, Jordan Mercier and Graham Elliott. Okay, so you go back, you're listening to the games in the 1940s, you watched, you were a fan. Who's your favorite hockey player of all time?
Bobby Orr.
Bobby Orr?
Attaboy.
By 100 miles.
By 100 miles, not even close.
And my second would be Ken Randall.
Naturally speaking, yeah. Bobby Orr, yeah, he seems to get a lot of play on this.
Now, one thing I might mention, Bobby Orr's got the book.
Oh, he does,
So
does
is
he?
Steve Stamkos, Dave Andreychuk. There's quite a few hockey players are picking this book up.
I was going to ask you, what's the reaction been to the book now that it's been out for, a certain period of time?
It's been very good. I'm pleased, very pleased with it. I've got a big family, and they've gotten behind it 100%, and we've been promoting it. The overall reason for writing the book was to see if we could get my grandfather into the Hockey Hall of Fame. That's a long shot, but we're going to keep going until at least we've given it our best shot.
Do you think there's a possibility that might happen down the line?
I would say it's a long shot, but I think there's a possibility, yeah. I do.
For many people out there who might be not as aware of the life and career of Ken Randall, we've been jokingly referring to him obviously as a very tough player, but what do you feel would be his best credentials in order to make it to the Hockey Hall of Fame?
Well, he was an outstanding junior player. He scored goals at a pace of over a goal a game for his first 10 years of his career. He won an OHA championship in 1909. He won 3 Maritime championships when the Maritime League was not quite as good as the NHA, which was the big league then, but pretty close. He went to 4 Stanley Cups, would have gone to a 5th, won 2. Played on a team that he said was the best team he ever played for, the 1925 Hamilton Tigers, who went on strike. They were suspended and they were robbed of a Stanley Cup. So he's got the credentials. And this statistic that 20% of his goals were game winners, that was a new one to me.
I think this is a point worth reiterating, and I think we talked about it the last time you were on the program, just how underrepresented players of his era are, just because of maybe, the education level of the sports writer of today might not go back and look at stuff like this, and that's why books like yours are very important. Do you still feel like they're drastically underrepresented in the Hockey Hall of Fame?
Well, I don't know that whether they're underrated in the Hall of Fame so much as they just aren't referred to as much because there was no TV, there was no radio until 1923. By the way, he played in the first game Hewitt broadcast on the radio. There was no reporters at games. Most of the games didn't have reporters. There was no photographers. They sent cartoonists, if you could believe it.
Wow.
That's what they do for this show most times.
And there was no film. If you try and find film from back there, there's the odd little snip, but there's not much. So they just didn't get the publicity back then. And but books like this, and there's some other ones that have come out recently, are going to bring to life some of these old timers that deserve to be acknowledged.
Tell me about the book. It's a hefty book. It's about 400 plus pages. But take me back to the genesis of deciding to write this and how long it took to actually produce it.
Well, I started to think about it 10 years ago. Got serious about 5 years ago, and then because I was looking for statistics to see if he deserved to be in the Hall of Fame. As I uncovered a lot of the statistics, that's a tough one, I found out that he was in the paper every day. There was something about him, and he was a star in his time. So by the time I was finished my searches in the various libraries throughout Ontario, I found that I had enough material for a book. So I thought a book would be a great instrument to get him some attention. And that's how the book evolved.
If you were looking for holiday shopping for a hockey fan, the book is entitled The Pepper Kid, The Life and Times of Ken Randall, Hockey's Bad Hombre. I know we had talked about this before. We only have a couple of minutes here left, but I know one of your prized possessions is an original sweater of the New York Americans. So he played for the New York Americans, and he played for them, and I think this is something that you and I talked about off air, but he played for them at a time where New York City was featuring some pretty impressive individuals, and your grandfather was able to rub shoulders with some pretty iconic sports figures.
Oh, yeah. He knew Babe Ruth, Damon Runyon, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Jack Dempsey. He met them all when he played in New York. And the sweater you referred to is a game-worn sweater from 1926. My cousin still has it today.
Very, very impressive stuff. Very
Amazing.
Impressive stuff.
And it's almost fun to kind of go back because we know about, the Leafs of now and the 80s and the 90s and a bit of a triumph or their run through a playoff run through the mid to late 90s. But we really don't kind of go back into our history quite nearly enough. And I think Toronto, one of the things we were talking about, Jordan, was that the Leafs have such and going back to the St. Pat's and the arenas, have such a cherished history that many don't know anything about. They know about 1967. They know about winning the Stanley Cup. They kind of know through the troubles of the 70s. They know about Harold Ballard. But going all the way back to the genesis of a storied franchise like Toronto, and more people are starting to become more and more familiar because of books like this and because more and more people are going, I need to tell a story. I need to get this out there. I need more people to know how important this was because otherwise we wouldn't be where we are right now.
Yeah, that's exactly true. I'll give you one name before we wind up.
Yeah.
And you'll read about him in the book, Babe Dye. Maybe in my top 10 hockey players ever.
Babe Dye. Do yourself a favor. Do a little bit of research on Babe Dye. Shayne, thank you so much for stopping by. Again, best of luck with the book. Fantastic stuff. If you want to get a copy, it is The Pepper Kid, The Life and Times of Ken Randall, Hockey's Bad Hombre.